And also, I'd like to welcome Lexi and her family here. It's awesome. Lexi's a cousin of mine by quite some distance, but we're still cousins. So good to have you guys with us. I'm glad you made it. Now, this morning, by request, we're going to talk about the possum. Now, I have, for those of you who are not that familiar with me, I have a series that I've worked on for years entitled Lessons from God's Created Creatures. And this is a very not normal type of lesson in the church, but I started doing this for children in an interest of getting children to remember lessons from the Bible. We will pick a created creature. And one of my children requested that I do a sermon on the possum. Ruth will remain nameless, but, or maybe I should say shameless. But she said, Papa, you need to do a lesson on the possum. Can you put this in with one of your created creatures? And so I told Kate, when Kate told me that, I'm like, I don't know if I have it in me to preach on the possum. But in Romans, if you open your Bibles, I always begin every created creatures lesson with the book of Romans chapter 1. And I've had kids up and down this valley who have put their input in for years on created creatures. So Dylan or Lacey, if you've got a favorite creature, let me know and I'll be happy to do a lesson on it for you. But for several years, I've had requests from kids to do created creatures lessons, not just my kids, but kids everywhere that I've preached at up and down the Ohio Valley, because it's something that they can relate to and they can see in their everyday lives. And when they see one of these creatures, they're reminded of God and the lessons that we study. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1 and in verse 20, Paul begins this section out by saying, for his, being God's, invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Okay? So what Paul is saying is, did you know there's two ways that we can learn about God? Obviously, oftentimes we look at the Bible and we see the Bible and we say we learn about God through the Bible. And that's right. That is absolutely correct. But Paul in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 says that we can learn about God by the things that he has created. And so I'm a little bit of a fossil nut, a little bit of an animal nut, and I learn about God in his creativity, his power, and even his divine nature, Paul says, by the things that are created. And so today we're going to learn lessons from the possum, one of creation's most humble creatures. The possum is not necessarily going to be found in the Columbus Zoo, although maybe there's a possum there. But you're not going to find them on exhibit. You're not going to see them in one of the favorite creatures of the world. But there is an American Possum Society. Had no idea. The possum, though, is in the same family with several other animals that are held in much higher esteem. They're in the same family as the koala bear. And several other little critters, the kangaroo. They're in the same family as the kangaroo. And so but when I look at the list in that family, I get clear down the bottom, there's possum. See, it's one of those ones that's not thought very highly of. The possum, or more correctly, opossum, takes its name from the Powhatan Indian words for white dog. John Smith of Jamestown, Virginia, described the possum as, quote, a head like a swine, a tail like a rat, bigness of a cat. I thought that was a very interesting way of describing a possum. But if you've never seen one and you only know European animals, how would you describe a possum better than that? The possum's probably, as I mentioned, one of the most looked down upon creatures Oh, my dad always said there's nothing filthier than a possum. And Dad just couldn't stand them. But in all of their looked down upon on this continent, possums serve a purpose in God's creation. Now, my uncles used to go out on Friday night. This is country entertainment in and of itself. They go out on Friday night and they go possum bashing. Drive the back roads and just look for a possum to hit on the road. Now, at one point I might have even been guilty of possum bashing just to see what it was like. So country entertainment has taken its on the possum. But did you know that possums clean up messes that no other animal will? Possums' dietary requirements require a high volume of calcium. And so possums get that calcium by eating the bones of dead animals, particularly roadkill, so we see them on the roads. Small rodents, smaller animals with softer bones. That's why God gave them the sharp teeth. So they're doing a job. Otherwise, can you imagine the sides of the highways littered with bones if nothing ever ate the bones? You ever wonder what happens to roadkill bones? I never even took the time to think about it. Possums are also immune to rattlesnake venom, and most poisonous snakes in this region can bite them and it has no effect. A possum, now this is one that I did know, found out about a year ago. One possum will eat up to 5,000 ticks each year. So, with Lyme's disease on the rise, we can thank the possum for keeping the tick population at least a little bit in control. So what can we learn? What can you and I learn from the possum? Because there's a biblical message that next time you see the possum, you're driving down the road at night and you see a possum, I want you to think about the biblical message that we can learn from the possum. In 1 Samuel, if you go back in your Old Testaments, 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel 16 and in verse 7. Samuel says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance, or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord looks on the heart." I want you to remember, God doesn't look at how beautiful we are or how handsome we might be on the outside. And I dare say that if you were to look at a possum, that mere description that John Smith gave, nose like a swine, tail like a rat, bigness of a cat, that would not be a description that would be endearing to me, that I would just, oh, I've got to see this creature. And yet, Samuel reminds us that God does not look at outward appearances to dictate what's important. Sometimes we tend to judge someone by their outward appearances, how they dress, how they look, how they act. Maybe we should slow down a little bit and consider the possum. We even judge him on how he looks. A little rodent. The first lesson that I really want to obtain from Mr. Possum himself is that possums are non-aggressive. Occasionally, if provoked, they will attack. But that's rarely the case. Usually, it is only self-defense. And if provoked enough, they play possum. I want you to think about that for a moment. How we interact with others around us. Are we aggressive? Look with me at what Jesus has to say in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 9. Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." You call yourself a Christian? I want to ask you this. If you're a Christian, then that means you're a child of God. Do we seek for peace? Do we pursue peace? Do we try to bring about peace with each other? Now go back into what Solomon says in the book of Proverbs for a moment. Proverbs chapter 16. In Proverbs chapter 16 and down in verse 32, so towards the end of that chapter, Proverbs 16, and in verse 32, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." I want you to think about that. Solomon says the person who is slow to anger is better than one who is mighty. Powerful. A person who's slow to anger is better than a powerful person. A person who rules his spirit is better than the person who conquers an entire city. I don't know about you. I can tell everybody else how to live. But when it comes to controlling who I am, my emotions, that, friends, takes a lot of work. To control what comes out of my mouth, to control my actions. Self-control is challenging. It's a lot easier to tell someone else how to do it than to practice it yourself. Now, Vernon's getting really much, much better at this. But every so often, I used to hear one of the girls wailing. I'll say, "Vernon hit me." I'm saying, "Why'd you hit her?" "I lost my temper." Okay, bad excuse. Now, he's working on this. I'm really proud of him. He's come a long ways. But he used to just snap when provoked. He is learning a lesson from the possum. Turn over, clear in the other end of the Bible in James chapter 1. James has a reference here that I think is really good for this idea of self-control. We looked at James chapter 1, verse 14 in Bible study, but now I want to look at James chapter 1 and just down a few verses in verse 19. James 1 in verse 19 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Let's just remember that. Now, there is a time, and we studied anger a while back by Don's request. We studied anger, and we studied the forms of anger. Anger in and of itself is an emotion created by God and can be used for good. But James says be slow to anger. Usually it's when we're hasty to anger that we make a mistake. A possum, even when provoked, is slow to respond and very rarely aggressive in nature. Second point, the good that a possum does is rarely seen. Number one, because they're nocturnal, which means they come out at night. And secondly, because they're typically a shy creature. But I want you to think about the benefits of the possum for a moment. Just the ticks alone. Just eating ticks and dead bones. If you take everything else out of the equation, those are very important jobs. Now, Lexi might remember Edgar Hansen. Do you remember Edgar Hansen growing up at church? Here's something I didn't know about Edgar Hansen. We grew up going to church with Edgar, and Edgar drove probably about 45 minutes to an hour to come to church every Sunday. He had been a member of a church that was closer to him called the Fairview Church of Christ. and for whatever reason, I don't know the details, had decided that he needed to leave that congregation, come to work. Well, Fairview is one of these old buildings with the gas stoves in the building, and nobody ever gave it a thought who lit the stove. No one ever gave it a thought who mowed the grass. No one ever gave it a thought who kept the cemetery stones put up in place and all of that stuff. Until one day, Edgar Hansen, who hadn't gone there in almost 50 years, had a stroke. I remember Mom's cousins up there at Fairview said, "We got to church Sunday and nobody had the heater on. The building was cold. It was below freezing." All because someone who had not attended there in over 40 years had been doing something that nobody saw. Nobody took notice of. That's a possum. Nobody pays attention. He goes about his business, doing the good that God created him to do, and nobody sees. Matthew chapter 6. I want you to think about this. Jesus has a lot to say about doing things to be seen. It's always good to be noticed. But if we're doing it just for the sheer fact of being noticed, we're doing it for the wrong reason. In Matthew chapter 6, down in we'll begin in verse 1, I guess, of Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." I can tell you there's a lot of things that goes on in this little congregation of people. There are people like Dennis, who goes to the hospital and hands out cards with service times and invites people to come to church. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm laying in the hospital bed with a heart that's not pumping right, fluid building up, I'm not sure that's where my mind would be. But Dennis is almost out of business cards. Now, there's other people. Dawn does all the editing on all of our YouTube videos that go out. Nobody ever sees that on YouTube. They might hear my voice on YouTube, but they have no idea what goes on behind. My own editor-in-chief, Kate, does all the PowerPoint. I don't do the PowerPoint. I lay it out on paper and she puts it on the computer screen. There's just so much that goes on. You ever wonder who makes the communion bread? Or does it just simply appear? Typically, Celia makes the communion bread. There are so many things that go on in any congregation that we take for granted, but yet it's stuff that has to be done. When Cynthia was with us, how many times before she passed away, how many times did I come in and the building was cleaned? We never knew who cleaned it. It just magically cleaned itself. There are things that are done that sometimes we take for granted. And they're not done because they want praise or glory or even thanks sometimes. Matthew chapter 23, down in verse 28 of that chapter. Actually, let's begin with verse 27. Jesus says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly," see, this goes back to doing things to be seen, "which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteousness to others, but within you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Your King James Version will say iniquity. Jesus is cautioning us not to be people who just want to be seen. It's a trap easy for us to fall into. And again, back in James, this time in chapter 2. James is one of my favorite books because it's so simple and straightforward. Very short book, very condensed. James is a simple person. Paul sometimes writes, and I'm not saying I don't like Paul's writings, but Paul sometimes, dresses things up a little bit. And James just cuts right down to the bare bones important issues. In James chapter 2 and verse 17, James says, so faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. James says there's a need. And if you don't fulfill that need, even if it's not a prominent place, your faith is dead. So bottom line, possums are not aggressive. Possums are rarely seen or really even appreciated for what they do, but they do it because that's what God created them to do. Last point on the possum is, we learn a lesson from the possum. The possum teaches us that life is short. The average lifespan for a possum is 2 to 4 years. That's not very long. Our cats and dogs, Rover's 12 years old. It's getting up there for a dog. Okay, we haven't had a dog 12 years old for a long time, but we did have a dog that was, 12, 13 years old. It's old for a dog. Think about it. Old for a possum's 4 years. Life is short. I don't care who you are. We've buried family members that have been nearly 100 years old. And I've buried family members that have been in there much younger than I am. In their 30s. Life is short. While we're in James, let's look over at chapter 4 and see what he says here. James 4:13. James says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist. King James Version will say a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, to him it is sin. James' point is life is short. Do the right thing. Do what needs to be done. Go back a little bit farther in our Bibles towards Revelation to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1. And in verse 24, Peter says, for all flesh is like grass, and it is all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever. What Peter says, life is so short. Jesus in Matthew's gospel says, consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet I say unto you, not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed like one of these. Jesus is drawing attention to the daylily, the shortness of its life. We love daylilies. The blossom is here today, gone tomorrow. Back in the Old Testament, the book of Psalms, Psalm 90. Psalm 90 in verse 12. Psalm 90 in verse 12, the psalmist says, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. The psalmist says, Lord, help us to understand that our days are short. By getting wisdom, we understand what's important in life. got a few fun facts I wanted to share with you just for the kids' sake. When Ruth requested this lesson on the possum, I think she had in mind to talk about how the possum gives birth. And she had, I think, in her mind that, maybe all creatures gave birth like the possum before the fall of man, before sin entered the world. One of the punishments for sin was pain in childbirth. Go back and read Genesis chapter 3. And so she kind of had in mind that possums have painless childbirth. And the pregnancy cycle is for about 11 to 12 days. Very short time. Then the babies are basically born, if you will, at the embryo stage. But instead of actually having contractions, childbirth, the babies essentially crawl out or swim out, and they swim or crawl. The mother possum will lick her stomach to make a wet track, and they will crawl out up her stomach into her pouch. At this little teeny, smaller than a dime, God created them to do that. And so I think that's the direction Ruth had wanted it to go. But possums, while we don't think much of them, apparently they were thought of very highly in the past as a delicacy. President Taft apparently was very fond of possum. Now, I can't even imagine, yes, what's President Biden having for dinner tonight? He's having roast possum, sire. So that's just one thing I wanted to throw in there at the very end. In fact, closing thoughts as we wrap this morning's lesson up. Not everyone has to be a leader. Not everyone has to be out in front. In fact, I know a lot of you don't like to be out in front. But not everyone has to have an important role in the church in order to be of service to God and service to our fellow man, our brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, I think we put this picture up to represent my wife. Covered in, possums usually have, on an average of 12 to 14 babies that survive the transfer from mama's tummy to the pouch. And so anyway, I don't think we're there yet with 9. But they're unsung heroes. And people in the church who do things behind the scenes are unsung heroes. People who never do it for praise. They do it because it needs done. They're today's unsung heroes and often unappreciated people. We should never think that these people are forgotten, because whatever you do, if you're doing it for the good of Jesus, and you're doing it because you love your brothers and sisters in Christ, we appreciate it, and so do those around you. You're here this morning. Maybe you're not a child of God. Maybe you've never made the commitment in your life. I want you to think about this. It's not simple. It's not rocket science. These steps are found in the Bible. But in order to believe in God, you've got to know that He is there. You've got to hear about God. You have to believe that God exists, repent of your sins, confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, and finally be buried in baptism. Paul says baptism is like a burial, dying to your old self. In Romans chapter 6, he describes that. And in Peter's first letter, chapter 3, verse 21, it says, the like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God. The answer of a good conscience towards God is being willing to do what God requires of us. And I've always said the hardest one is not even on the screen. Revelation 2 and verse 10 says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." If you're here this morning, maybe you're thinking about it. I would encourage you to let us know. We'd be happy to help in any way. You'll take out your songbooks, the invitation song.